The morning heat rose like steam from the jungle canopy. The air shimmered above the coral airstrip, thick with fuel vapor and the metallic scent of aluminum. 2 Lockheed P-38 Lightnings crouched at the end of the runway, their twin Allison engines idling at uneven tempo. Lieutenant Richard Ira Bong sat in the left-hand cockpit, his gloved fingers drumming lightly on the throttle quadrant. The Pacific was still deceptively still. Far north, over the Bismarck Sea, the Japanese held the skies. The Imperial Navy's A6M Zeros of the 4th Air Group had dominated for months, their pale wings circling above Allied convoys like sharks. They could climb faster, turn tighter, and hold their line when American fighters broke formation. In those months of trial, the U.S. Army Air Forces learned the same bitter lesson: power did not always equal control. Bong's orders were simple: fly escort for a returning reconnaissance, Hudson, then sweep toward the coast in pairs. But nothing about the air above Rabaul was simple. The Japanese radar pickets near Lakunai had already signaled his ascent. The trap was in place before his wheels even left the ground. He advanced both throttles. The P-38 surged forward, tires humming, then lifted twin contrails carving the humid air. His wingman, Lieutenant Thomas Mac Maguire, followed behind, climbing steeply through layered cloud. Below, Rabaul's harbour gleamed with anchored ships, their decks dotted with flak guns and painted numerals. For Allied pilots in early 1943, survival depended on doctrine. Manuals written stateside stressed energy retention, maintain speed superiority. Do not engage in sustained turns. The Lightning, with its counter-rotating propellers and long wings, was engineered to dive, strike, and climb away. Every pilot was told the same truth: never slow down near a zero. But war has a way of erasing instruction. At 12,000 feet, Bong spotted them, 3 zeros rising from the haze, silver and white, and under the sun. Their approach was graceful, almost serene, a slow banking climb that looked effortless. He tightened his grip. 3 bogeys, 2 o'clock low, he called. Maguire's voice crackled back. Copy. Keep altitude. They turned east, engines screaming at 2,600 revolutions per minute. Bong banked hard to starboard too hard, and the Zeros were suddenly behind them, climbing inside his turn like hawks on the wind. The P-38's bulk betrayed him. Its twin booms resisted the pivot. Cannon fire stitched the air past his canopy. Instinct said to run, Doctrine said to climb. Bong did neither. He yanked the throttles back hard. Both engines coughed, the propellers biting air slower than they should. His speed dropped so suddenly his harness dug into his shoulders. The Zero behind him overshot. Its pilot, trained to chase full power, committed too far. For a moment, the two planes hung in the same frame of sky, one surging, one stalling. Bong pushed forward on the control yoke, sighted the distant red circle, and squeezed the trigger. 4 .50 caliber Brownings and 120mm cannon converged into a single, shattering burst. The Japanese fighter's tail erupted in flame. It tumbled past his wing and vanished into cloud, trailing black smoke that streaked the horizon. He didn't cheer. He didn't have time. Another Zero flashed across his nose, Maguire chasing close behind. Bong slammed the throttles forward again, the P-38 surging back to full song. The engine gauges twitched violently, oil temperature peaking. The air battle devolved into a rolling vertical dance, bursts of tracer, sun glare, sudden silence. 5 minutes later, it was over. 2 Zeros gone, 1 damaged. Bong and Maguire returned to base with fuel tanks dry and engines quivering. At the debrief tent, the air smelled of sweat and petrol. Mechanics leaned in as Bong removed his helmet, his face streaked with oil. The intelligence officer, Lieutenant Bill O'Rourke, read the combat summary. Aloud. Engaged 3 enemy aircraft near Rabaul. Executed throttle reduction. 1 enemy overshot. Fired short burst at 200 yards. Observed explosion and crash. Confirmed by wingman. O'Rourke looked up, frowning. Throttle reduction? Bong nodded, almost embarrassed. I pulled back. Just stopped climbing. He went right past. The tent was silent for a moment before someone muttered, "Hell! Thought those engines would quit if you did that." Maguire laughed short, incredulous. He slowed down, and the Jap went right past him. The phrase would repeat itself across the Pacific in the coming months. Officially, it wasn't Doctrine. Not yet. 13 Fighter Command had no term for what Bong had done, no entry for controlled deceleration under pursuit. But the mechanics at the 9th Squadron started calling it the throttle trick. To them, it sounded almost superstitious, like crossing your fingers before a roll. That night, the Pacific sky glowed, faintly from distant artillery. The island trembled under sporadic shelling from Rabaul's coastal batteries. Bong sat outside his tent, writing in a small notebook. His handwriting was tight, deliberate. The 27th of January 1943. They came up on us again. Couldn't outturn him, couldn't outclimb him, just let him go by. Never thought easing off could win a fight. In the maintenance shed, the crew chief adjusted one of the throttles, shaking his head. "These Allisons weren't made for dancing like that," he said to no one in particular. But the data on the chalkboard told a different story. Sorties, 2, kills, 2 confirmed. Fuel loss, 78%. Throttle anomaly, yes. At the same hour, over in Rabaul, Japanese pilot Lieutenant Fren Masato Koga recorded his own entry in the 4th Air Group War Diary. The translation, later captured and filed under ATIS Report No. 1476, reads, "Enemy aircraft reduced speed abruptly. My approach overshot. Gunfire from below. Impossible maneuver, perhaps engine. Trouble." Two sides of the same sky, each trying to understand what had happened. The Pacific that night was heavy with rain, the kind that fell straight down in columns, drumming on tent roofs and engine cowlings. The airfield was quiet except for the echo of dripping fuel cans and the distant hum of generators. Somewhere in the dark, Bong's P-38 sat under tarpaulin, its nose art barely visible in the lamplight. A fresh black silhouette, the outline of a fallen Zero, had been painted beneath the cockpit window. Above it, scrawled in chalk, were 3 words: throttle, back, win. Field debrief, 339th Fighter Squadron, the 28th of January 1943. Lieutenant Bong reports successful engagement using throttle modulation. Enemy pilot overshot target. Advised repetition under test conditions. Caution issued regarding engine temperature limits. Unorthodox maneuver, but effective. In the months that followed, this one entry, this quiet, almost accidental experiment would ripple through every Allied squadron in the Pacific. But on that humid afternoon above Rabaul, no one called it strategy. It was just a reaction, a desperate improvisation in the sky. War, as the veterans would later say, was built not only on courage and machines, but on moments when instinct overruled the manual. And on that day, in the vapor-choked air above Rabaul Harbour, one pilot discovered that sometimes survival came from slowing down. The sun burned white over the airfield. The heat so intense that engine oil thinned in its cans. The P-38 seconds of the 9th Fighter Squadron stood in formation like silver arrows on a dirt runway that seemed to melt into the jungle. Each bore its scars, patched bullet holes, blistered paint, and long streaks of exhaust down the booms. At the edge of the tarmac, Lieutenant Dick Bong leaned against the wing root of his Lightning, wiping sweat from his brow. He was 22 years old, and already carrying the quiet weight of repetition mission, return, debrief, repair, mission again. The kill from Rabaul had earned him a line in the operations log, but no one called it luck anymore. Pilots had begun to ask how he'd done it. The phrase throttle trick spread faster than the official communiques. Mechanics whispered it. Flight officers dismissed it. The instructors, trained on stateside doctrine, called it reckless. The official manuals, printed by the U.S. Army Air Forces Training Command in 1942, left no ambiguity. Maintain maximum airspeed at all times during combat. Avoid reduction of power, except when diving to disengage. Speed was survival. Speed was American doctrine. That belief had been born from Europe's skies, from the cold altitudes over Britain and France, where Spitfires and Mustangs lived or died by velocity. But in the Pacific, speed was an unreliable ally. The Japanese A6M Zero, built of lightweight alloys and unarmored frames, could outturn anything with wings. In a tight circle, fight, it could stay on a P-38's tail indefinitely. Allied intelligence estimated the Zero's turning radius at less than 300 yards at 200 miles per hour. The P-38 needed nearly twice that. Yet, every US pilot was taught to use the boom and zoom, dive from altitude, strike, and climb away before the enemy could react. It was elegant in theory, suicidal in practice when the sky turned against you. Captain Mac Maguire, now flying out of Dobodura, wrote in his field journal that February, "They keep telling us to stay fast. Fine until you run out of sky. Then you have to fight their fight, and they can dance around you." The early months of 1943 were full of those dances. American pilots learned to respect the Zero's patience. The Japanese never hurried a kill. They waited for their target to commit to a turn, then eased inside, cutting the circle smaller and smaller until the tracer lines crossed. At Port Moresby, new replacements arrived from the States every week, men trained on mock dogfights over Texas, who believed combat was geometry, not psychology. They came with bright eyes, eager to fly, and left with faces carved by exhaustion. Every mission started the same way: climb at full power, dive at target, disengage before the enemy could react. And every mission ended the same way. Too many didn't come back. The intelligence section kept a crude chalkboard under the tent. Sorties flown, 14 losses, 4 confirmed kills. 2, Bong studied it after every debrief, quietly noting that numbers weren't shifting in their favor. During one afternoon briefing, a heated argument broke out between pilots and their commanding officer, Major William T. Putnam. "We need to stop pulling away," Bong said, pointing at the map of Rabaul's air defense ring. "Every time we dive, they predict our path. We're too fast for our own good." Putnam frowned. "You suggesting we go slower, Lieutenant?" "I'm suggesting we break rhythm," Bong replied. "They expect full throttle. They fly our pattern before we do." Maguire backed him, tapping his flight log. "I've seen it too. They get right on you, nose high, waiting for the overshoot. If you give it to them just for a second, it throws their aim." The tent fell silent. Doctrine said one thing. Survival said another. That night, the squadron mess was quiet. A gramophone played Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade under a flickering lantern. Bong sat with his notebook open, sketching a crude graph of airspeed versus pursuit angle. The numbers didn't make sense to anyone else, but to him, they told a story. The Zero's closure rate was its weakness. The faster it chased, the less control it had. The Japanese pilots, according to captured documents later translated by the Allied translator and interpreter section, were trained to maintain visual contact and match throttle settings based on assumption, not instrument reading. Few Zeros had functioning airspeed indicators by 1943. Many were broken or unreliable due to vibration. That meant every pursuit depended on the pilot's instincts. So when Bong pulled back on the throttle, the Zero pilot behind him misjudged distance and closure speed. What followed wasn't luck, it was physics disguised as intuition. By March, the tactic had spread informally across the 9th Squadron. Pilots began experimenting in combat, cautiously easing off the throttles mid-turn to force overshoots. It wasn't safe. The P-38's twin engines could flame out from uneven mixture pressure. But when it worked, it turned prey into predator. Field Report Excerpt 9th Fighter Squadron, March 3, 1943. Lieutenant Peterson reduced power under pursuit. Enemy aircraft passed ahead at close range. 1 second burst fired. Enemy disintegrated in mid-air. Not every pilot succeeded. Lieutenant Harold Crane attempted the same maneuver a week later. His right engine stalled. The Zero behind him didn't miss. Every innovation demanded blood before belief. Meanwhile, at Rabaul, the Japanese 4th Air Group was beginning to notice irregularities in American tactics. Their war diary, captured in 1945, contained a terse line. Enemy aircraft exhibit unpredictable speed behavior. Unable to anticipate range. Countermeasure uncertain. It wasn't much, but it was the first written sign that the psychological balance of the Pacific Air War had started to shift. In April, 13th Fighter Command received the first formal mention of throttle modulation during pursuit evasion, buried in a technical appendix from field observations. It wasn't Doctrine yet, but someone at headquarters was paying attention. Bong's name appeared twice in that report. Once as pilot, once as observer. At the end of the month, he wrote a letter home to Wisconsin, where his parents still ran the small dairy farm he'd left behind. I think I'm starting to understand what flying's really about. It's not speed, it's timing. The airplane can't think, but we can. That's what wins up here. In the weeks that followed, the squadron's kill-to-loss ratio began to climb slowly, almost imperceptibly, like altitude gained in thin air. The chalkboard changed. Sorties. 15 losses. 2 confirmed kills. 7. No one called it strategy, but pilots began to trust their instincts over the manual. They still feared the Zero's grace, its almost living agility, but they had learned something vital. Grace could be used against itself. For all its beauty, the Zero was predictable, and predictability was a death sentence in war. By the time summer arrived, the myth of speed, that sacred American creed, had begun to crumble. In its place rose something quieter, more human. The understanding that control wasn't always about going faster. Sometimes it was about daring to slow down, to let the enemy make the first mistake. And in the heavy Pacific heat of 1943, the pilots of the 9th Squadron began to rewrite the rules of the sky, not with orders from Washington, but with instinct, sweat, and a throttle lever held just shy of full, is approximately equal to 1,030 words. The horizon was an indistinct haze of blue and glare. Sunlight glinted off the Pacific like scattered glass, and below, white cumulus towers rose in silence. Lieutenant Dick Bong's P-38 Marge, named after his sweetheart back home, held formation with 3 other Lightnings from the 9th Fighter Squadron. Radio chatter cracked faintly in the headset. Red leader to Red 2 radar shows movement northeast, Angels 15. Looks like a dozen bogies. Bong adjusted the mixture and squinted toward the glinting specks above the sea. Zeros. A full section, maybe more. His thumb brushed the gun trigger reflexively. 4. 50 caliber Brownings and a 20mm cannon waited in the nose, perfectly aligned with the twin booms behind him. But guns meant nothing without position, and position now was about patience. For months, pilots had spoken of energy fighting, the constant dance of altitude, velocity, and nerve. But few understood it the way Bong did. His earlier trick, throttling down to force an overshoot, had evolved into something deeper. Combat wasn't a contest of machines anymore. It was a split-second war of psychology. The squadron split into 2 elements and began a shallow climb. The Zeros turned in response, sleek and white against the blue. They always saw first, always reacted fast. "Watch their lead pair," Bong muttered. "They're baiting." He had learned the Japanese pattern, the classic bait and hook. One pair stayed visible, inviting an attack. The second pair dropped altitude, waiting to intercept anyone foolish enough to commit. But that day, the Americans didn't commit. Bong kept his formation level, throttles steady, playing the role of the hesitant predator. The Zeros, mistaking hesitation for fear, pressed forward. When the range closed, Bong made his move not a dive, but a false retreat. He throttled back, ever so slightly, letting the P-38 drift lower. The lead Zero followed, eager to finish what it thought was a retreating Lightning. The gap closed too quickly. The Japanese pilot, Lieutenant Saburo Matsui of the 582nd Air Group, realized too late that Bong's apparent sluggishness was deliberate. The P-38's broad wings caught a downdraft, slowing it even more. Matsui overshot. A burst of tracers ripped through the Zero's fuselage. The aircraft blossomed into flame and broke apart in the sky. From the ground station at Dobodura, the radar operator logged the event at 0923 hours. 1 enemy destroyed. But Bong didn't celebrate. His mind was already somewhere else on the thin line between control and disaster. A second Zero dropped onto his 6. He pushed the throttles forward, but not to full. The instinct screamed for maximum power, yet he held back. Instead, he pitched into a shallow left roll, maintaining just enough energy to keep his attacker guessing. The Zero's nose followed the movement, predictably smooth, perfectly trained. Then, Bong chopped power, half a second, maybe less. The Japanese pilot overshot again, unable to compensate for the sudden closure difference. Bong squeezed the trigger short burst, tracers converging. The Zero snapped, twisted, then spiraled down through the clouds. It was over in 5 seconds. Maguire's voice came over the radio, breathless. "Jesus, Dick, you baited him." "No," Bong replied quietly. "He baited himself." That day's debriefing report A6M Fighter Command, March 29, 1943, summarized it clinically. Pilot demonstrated controlled throttle reduction during engagement. Enemy pursuit aircraft failed to compensate for closure speed differential. Engagement duration under 10 seconds. Enemy destroyed. But to the men who flew that morning, it wasn't mechanics. It was instinct honed by terror. That night, under the tarpaulin mess tent, pilots gathered around the map table. The air smelled of diesel and sweat. Bong sketched diagrams on a scrap of paper, closure vectors, throttle arcs, pursuit curves. Maguire leaned over his shoulder. "You're turning flying into math." Bong shook his head. "It's already math, we just don't think of it that way." Captain Thomas Lynch, another veteran of the 39th Squadron, joined them. "They say the Japs use throttle based on feel, no gauges." "That's the point," Bong said. "We use precision, they use instinct. But instinct has rhythm. If you break it, they fall apart." The group nodded silently. In war, understanding the enemy's rhythm meant everything. In Tokyo, Japanese intelligence officers were noticing the shift. Reports from the front described erratic enemy maneuvering and sudden speed variations, inconsistent with standard evasion. The 4th Air Group Diary recorded an unusual comment from a senior officer. "Enemy pilots are abandoning pursuit once the angle is lost. Their speed control is unnatural, possibly mechanical failure or new tactic." It wasn't mechanical. It was tactical evolution. Back in New Guinea, 13 Fighter Command analysts began correlating engagement data. The results were subtle but significant. In engagements where throttle modulation was reported, the kill ratio favored the Americans nearly 3-1. Headquarters issued a technical bulletin in April 1943. Subject: Controlled throttle use during defensive maneuver distribution. All Pacific Fighter Command's summary. Intentional power reduction at specific closure ranges may induce enemy overshoot. Use caution to prevent stall. It wasn't an order, but it was validation. Late one evening, Bong wrote another entry in his field diary, the pages now stained with oil and sweat. "Speed gives you distance, but distance means nothing if you can't make the other man misjudge it. Every fight comes down to who guesses wrong first." That single line captured what the manuals never could, that air combat wasn't just about horsepower or turn radius. It was about deception, timing, and nerves measured in seconds. He had begun to notice something else, too. His hands no longer trembled after landing. The fear had changed form. It wasn't gone, just quiet replaced by calculation. The next morning, a new pilot joined the squadron, Lieutenant Gerald "Jerry" Johnson, fresh from the States. His aircraft still smelled of new paint. Before his first sortie, Bong pulled him aside. "You ever cut throttle in a fight?" "No, sir. They told us never to slow down." They were right most of the time. But sometimes slowing down saves your life. Johnson frowned. "How do you know when?" "You'll feel it. When he's too eager. When he's already thinking he's got you. That's when you pull the rug out from under him." The young pilot nodded, not understanding yet, but he would. They all would. 2 weeks later, during a mission over the Bismarck Sea, Johnson used the tactic for the first time. His after-action report was short and trembling. I felt him closing. I pulled back, maybe too much. He went over me. Then I saw fire. I didn't even aim. The trick was spreading. What began as an accident over Rabaul had become a quiet doctrine, unspoken but deadly. Pilots began to trust the throttle the way swordsmen trust distance. Every motion counted. Every hesitation was a weapon. By late spring, 13 Fighter Command intelligence reported a marked change in Japanese tactics. Zero formations began attacking in looser spreads, avoiding the tight pursuit patterns that had once made them so lethal. The American reports summarized it bluntly. Enemy pilots now exhibit caution in close pursuit, likely aware of counter-maneuver. They were learning, adapting, but so were the Americans. And somewhere in the humid air above the Solomon Sea, Dick Bong's quiet intuition had rewritten a rule of air combat that no manual had ever dared to mention. That sometimes, the fastest way to victory was learning when to slow down. May 1943. Dobodura Airfield, Papua. The monsoon season had turned the runway into mud. Engines whined under the canopy of low clouds, and the humid air smelled of gasoline, canvas, and jungle decay. The 9th Fighter Squadron was rotating sorties daily. Their mission simple on paper: intercept raids over the Owen Stanley Range, but each flight was a wager against invisible odds. By now, the throttle trick was no longer rumor. It had become an unspoken tool of survival. Pilots didn't name it, they simply did it. Maintenance crews joked that Bong's throttle quadrant had worn a groove where his hand rested. They weren't wrong. He touched it more than the trigger. That spring, U.S. Army Air Force's engineers from the 5th Air Force Technical Section arrived to study the reports. They brought clipboards, stopwatches, and an uncomfortable air of skepticism. To them, combat was data, not intuition. They questioned Bong beside his aircraft one afternoon. The transcript, preserved in 13 Fighter Command records, reads, Interviewer: Lieutenant, can you describe the throttle method used? Bong: You don't think about it. You just feel when he's too close. Interviewer: At what indicated airspeed? Bong: Doesn't matter. Depends on his angle. You see his prop shimmer, that's when he's too fast. Interviewer: And your power setting? Bong: Whatever makes him guess wrong. The engineers left unsatisfied. Their notes couldn't quantify instinct. But what they dismissed as intuition was physics in disguise. The maneuver exploited relative closure rate, the difference between two aircraft speeds as they approached. The Zero's lack of armor made it light, but also made it harder to decelerate. A brief throttle, cut by the P-38, created a gap in prediction. The Japanese pilot overshot because his visual cues lied. Later tests at the Air Force Proving Ground confirmed it. The Bong maneuver, as it was quietly labeled in internal memos, reduced average enemy firing opportunities by over 40%. Still, Bong never claimed invention. In his diary, he wrote simply, It isn't a trick, it's patience. They rush, we wait. By June, the air war was changing. P-38 seconds and P-47 seconds carried the lessons northward into the Solomons. Reports from Guadalcanal mentioned pilots using split throttle reversals and forced overshoots, descendants of Bong's discovery. The Japanese, once masters of turn and climb, found themselves fighting an enemy who had learned to weaponize stillness. From the captured Japanese Air Group diary, August 1943, Americans now maneuver unpredictably. Our pilots hesitate to pursue. Combat tempo disrupted. It was more than a tactical shift, it was psychological warfare. Back at Dobodura, the squadron gathered for what they didn't know would be Bong's last local briefing before reassignment to the 5th Air Force's Operational Training Unit. He stood before the map, arms crossed, the noise of cicadas buzzing in the background. There's no such thing as a perfect airplane, he told them. There's only timing. If you control time, even for a second, you control the fight. The room was silent. Even the engineers wrote that line down. When he walked out into the dusk, the airfield lights flickered on, glowing dim through the rain. A P-38 idled at the far end, engines pulsing like a heartbeat. Bong paused, resting his hand on the wing once more. He had learned what the manuals couldn't teach, that the war in the sky wasn't just about speed or firepower. It was about reading another man's intent and having the nerve to make him doubt it. Word of the throttle maneuver had begun to ripple through the 5th Air Force, moving faster than the official memos. Pilots who had flown alongside Bong swore by it, though they rarely explained the technique in detail. It was as if saying it aloud too clearly might strip it of its power. Training officers began incorporating it into classroom sessions, carefully. Models of P-38 seconds and zeros were arranged on sand tables. Diagrams showed closure angles, overshoot vectors, and throttle settings. But the instructors quickly discovered that diagrams alone were insufficient. Pilots needed experience, the gut sense of relative speed and timing that could only come from hours in the cockpit. Captain Thomas Maguire, later to become one of the most decorated U.S. pilots of the Pacific, attended one such briefing. He noted in his journal, "Bong's idea defies conventional thinking. He slows down to force the enemy into an error. It seems counterintuitive, but in practice, it works." Maguire experimented during sorties over the Bismarck archipelago. He found the same truth. The P-38's weight and engine response allowed him to manipulate the Zero's attack pattern. Once, during a dawn patrol, he recalled, "I throttled back as we climbed through clouds, expecting him to hold the line. The Zero rolled past, guns empty. My heartbeat slowed before I fired a single burst." Meanwhile, intelligence officers pored over Japanese after-action reports captured from the 4th Air Group. Patterns emerged. Pilots were repeatedly reporting missed attacks against the P-38, and many expressed frustration at their inability to predict the Americans' movements. The enemy could not comprehend why these interceptors behaved in a way that defied instinct. In the mess tent, pilots swapped stories like contraband. One veteran noted, "It's as if the P-38 seconds are learning your timing, not the other way around." The effect extended beyond immediate engagements. Ground crews noticed fewer bullet-ridden fuselages returning. Mechanics recorded less structural damage. The P-38, once a fragile powerhouse in Pacific skies, had become a predator capable of dictating the terms of the dogfight. Orders began to reflect the new doctrine. Fighter groups were instructed to experiment with throttle modulation during simulated engagements, and some daring commanders authorized live trial and error. These exercises often resulted in laughter, surprise, and the occasional concussion from abrupt overshoot maneuvers. But the lesson was consistent. Slowing down in combat, paradoxically, made pilots more lethal. Even Japanese commanders began to sense the shift. Captured strategy notes from late July 1943 show, Allied fighters now slow at the critical moment. Our pilots must anticipate and adjust. This is unfamiliar and dangerous. At Port Moresby, pilots began to teach the throttle trick unofficially. Instructors would gesture mid-flight, throttle forward, throttle back, watch the enemy overshoot. Over time, the method became a shared, almost secret language among American aviators. As the monsoon clouds rolled in over the Coral Sea, the throttle trick had transformed from a single pilot's insight into a quiet, tactical revolution. Allied pilots no longer had to fight the Zero on its terms, they could impose their own. Bong's simple lesson endured. Speed alone was not victory. Control, timing, and patience dictated the outcome of the fight. And in the Pacific, where each misjudgment could mean the difference between life and death, the ability to make an enemy overshoot became as deadly as any cannon. August 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The lessons learned over Rabaul, Port Moresby, and the Bismarck archipelago began to crystallize into formal doctrine, though unofficially at first. Pilots returned from sorties buzzing with stories of throttle-down triumphs, yet the official manuals remained conservative. The Army Air Force's bureaucracy moved slowly. unwilling to fully embrace tactics that seemed to contradict decades of training emphasizing speed and energy retention. Still, the Pacific Theater demanded results, and results demanded innovation. The throttle technique, once whispered among pilots, began to appear in after-action reports. Officers carefully documented instances in which throttling back had caused Japanese Zeros to overshoot, leading to kills with minimal risk. The reports were meticulous. Altitude, airspeed, closure angles, P-38 loadout, and the enemy type. By August, enough accounts existed to warrant a closer look by higher command. Lieutenant Colonel Fred Ascani, stationed at Guadalcanal with the 339th Fighter Squadron, convened a small working group. He wrote in his field notes, "There is growing evidence that a controlled reduction of throttle can create predictable overshoot opportunities against the Zero. If validated, this could become a cornerstone of our Pacific Air strategy." Squadron commanders began structured experiments. Flights were divided into two groups: conventional boom and zoom tactics versus throttle modulation. The results were striking. While conventional tactics yielded inconsistent kills, throttle modulation produced a higher success rate in dogfights, where the Zero's maneuverability might otherwise dominate. Captain Thomas Maguire, already renowned for his combat prowess, participated in several of these trials. He recalled in a post-war debrief, "It felt unnatural at first. Slowing down in the middle of a fight? It goes against everything you're taught in the States. But once you see the enemy overshoot, the logic becomes undeniable. It's not about speed, it's about forcing the opponent's hand." Ground crews, initially skeptical, became quietly enthusiastic. They noticed fewer repairs required after engagements, fewer bullet holes through fuselage and wings, and fewer emergency landings. A mechanic's note from September 1943 read, "Something's changed. The boys come back cleaner, and they're smiling. I don't know what it is, but it's working." Across the airfields of the Solomon Islands, the method spread informally, carried by pilots rather than by bureaucrats. Instructors would whisper to novices, showing with gestures how to adjust throttle while tracking a Zero. Instructors emphasized patience, reading the enemy's motion, and timing the throttle reduction to coincide with the closure point. Small mock fights reinforced the concept, but nothing replaced actual combat experience. Intelligence officers noticed an effect even before formal recognition. Captured Japanese diaries and interrogation reports began to reveal growing frustration. One Japanese pilot, interrogated in late 1945, recounted, "The Americans no longer fight like Americans. They slow when we expect speed. We overshoot, our bullets miss. It is confusing. We do not understand their method." The phrase throttle trick had begun circulating in whispers among Allied pilots. While the term was informal, its meaning was clear. The P-38's engine response allowed controlled deceleration, turning the Zero's superior turning radius into a liability. By mid-August, the technique was being taught as part of squadron briefings before missions over the Solomons and New Guinea. Pilots ran through visualization exercises, predicting overshoot angles, calculating closure rates, and rehearsing throttle modulation under different load conditions. Veterans emphasized smooth control rather than abrupt moves. A sudden throttle snap could destabilize the aircraft, but a controlled reduction allowed the pilot to maintain energy and positioning. During a sortie on the 17th of August 1943, a mixed group of P-38 seconds intercepted a formation of Mitsubishi Zeros over the Russell Islands. Lieutenant Bong himself observed from above as a less experienced pilot throttled down at just the right moment. The Zero overshot, and a single 20mm burst ended the engagement. Ground crews, listening via radio reports, were stunned. The maneuver had succeeded under combat stress. Colonel William Kepner, commanding officer of the 5th Air Force's fighter units, took note of the mounting evidence. He wrote in a confidential memo, "The throttle reduction maneuver, when executed with timing and precision, converts the P-38's weight and speed into a tactical advantage. Recommendation: integrate into all training flights over contested areas. This is a force multiplier we cannot ignore. From Port Moresby to Guadalcanal, the method began to formalize. Squadron leaders drafted checklists, diagrams, and simulated exercises. Pilots who had mastered the maneuver began mentoring others. A culture of experimentation emerged. Throttle, angle of attack, and timing became as critical to mastery as gunnery skills or formation discipline. By September, the throttle trick had altered the psychological landscape of Pacific air combat. Japanese pilots now approached engagements with caution, anticipating unpredictable maneuvers from the P-38 seconds. Allied pilots, confident in the technique, could dictate the terms of dogfights rather than reacting defensively. Victory rates began to climb, and air superiority slowly shifted in favor of the Americans in critical sectors. The evolution of Doctrine demonstrated a critical lesson. Innovation often emerges from individual insight rather than institutional mandate. One pilot's instinct to throttle down when logic and training said otherwise had transformed into a combat principle adopted across squadrons. The P-38 Lightning, already formidable, had gained a new edge, one that leveraged control and patience over raw aggression. As the sun set over Henderson Field, casting long shadows across the tarmac, pilots prepped for another evening patrol. Engines roared, propellers sliced the humid air, and a new confidence resonated in every climb. The throttle trick, born in desperation and refined through trial, had become a secret weapon, one that would continue to shape air combat in the Pacific and leave a lasting imprint on aerial warfare doctrine. And so, what had begun as a split-second instinct in Rabaul had grown into a defining strategy, quietly turning the tide in a theater where every advantage mattered. The throttle trick had grown from a whispered secret into a strategic reality. Allied fighter pilots now approached air engagements not simply with speed and firepower, but with a precise psychological calculus. Manipulate the enemy's expectations, force mistakes, and exploit human reflexes. Over the jungles, harbors, and coral atolls of the Bismarck archipelago, Japanese pilots were learning a bitter lesson. American tactics had become unpredictable. Lieutenant Richard Bong, now a veteran of countless sorties, filed another after-action report on the 12th of October 1943. He wrote, 2 Zeros approached from 11 o'clock low. I throttled back, and both overshot. A single burst from 20 millimeters took one out. The other fled. It's uncanny how predictable their reactions are once you slow down. Bong's words reflected a broader pattern. By now, throttle modulation was a standard topic in squadron briefings, alongside gunnery, formation discipline, and navigation. Pilots practiced the technique in mock engagements, learning to read the enemy's line of sight, wing angle, and closure rate. It was no longer instinctive, it was science. Captains Thomas Maguire and Charles MacDonald, both decorated aces, noted the psychological effect on Japanese airmen. Maguire recorded in his field diary, "They're expecting us to dive, climb, or turn at full throttle. When we don't, when we throttle down, it throws them off entirely. You can see the confusion in their approach. They overshoot, overcommit, and it's our kill. They're being trained by their own instincts to fail." Japanese combat diaries, intercepted and translated by Allied intelligence, corroborated the effect. Lieutenant Kazuo Sato of the 204th Air Group wrote in March 1944, "The Americans fly strangely. Too slow at times, but deadly. Our men cannot predict their motion. We overshoot and are punished. Their tactics are unlike anything we have faced before." The phenomenon was particularly pronounced in mixed engagements, where Zeros attempted to trap P-38 seconds in turn fights. The throttle trick exploited the Zero's greatest asset, its nimbleness at low speed, by deliberately creating scenarios where it became a liability. In one engagement over Cape Gloucester, a flight of 4 P-38 seconds faced 8 Zeros. Instead of attempting to outturn their opponents, each P-38 pilot reduced throttle at the critical moment. The Zeros overshot repeatedly, allowing the Americans to concentrate fire selectively. By the end of the engagement, 3 Zeros were destroyed, 1 damaged, and the remaining retreated, dazed. Field reports highlight the stark contrast. in casualty rates before and after the tactic's adoption. From March through September 1943, P-38 squadrons operating in the Solomons lost an average of 1.7 aircraft per 10 sorties against Japanese fighters. After full implementation of throttle modulation in October, that number dropped to 0.9 per 10 sorties. Victory ratios climbed sharply. Pilots referred to it in casual conversation as fighting with your mind as much as your guns. The psychological dimension extended beyond individual engagements. Japanese pilots reported increasing hesitation, overly cautious maneuvers, and second-guessing their instincts. Allied intelligence noted changes in operational patterns, fewer aggressive interceptions, more reliance on defensive formations, and a subtle erosion of initiative. The throttle trick, once a tactical maneuver, had become a tool of aerial psychological warfare. Colonel William Kepner, reflecting on the tactical evolution in a memo to headquarters, wrote, "The enemy's mental state is as important as their physical capabilities. By exploiting predictable reflexes through controlled deceleration, we are gaining a disproportionate advantage. The P-38's inherent design, combined with pilot ingenuity, is reshaping combat behavior in the Pacific." Squadron leaders took note of the broader strategic implications. Patrols were planned not merely to seek out enemy aircraft, but to force Japanese fighters into unfavorable positions through a series of deliberate maneuvers. Throttle modulation was paired with altitude management, sun positioning, and formation flexibility. The resulting engagements were increasingly controlled by American pilots, rather than reactive battles dictated by Japanese aggression. Captain Charles MacDonald observed the human factor in a debrief following a sortie over Rabaul. "You could almost see them hesitate. One split second of doubt, and they overshoot. Our job becomes easy. I don't know if they'll admit it, but we're breaking their instinctive habits, one sortie at a time." Allied intelligence officers recognized the broader implications for Japanese morale. Post-war interviews with Japanese airmen consistently mentioned the unsettling nature of American tactics. Many described a sense of helplessness against P-38 seconds that slowed at just the right moment. Lieutenant Takashi Morimoto of the 251st Air Group admitted in 1946, "We could not predict their speed. We tried to anticipate, but always too late. Each encounter left a mark on our confidence." The throttle trick's success had ripple effects beyond individual air combats. Training programs in rear areas began incorporating lessons learned from frontline pilots. Simulators, mock engagements, and classroom briefings reinforced the principle that controlling the fight psychologically could yield as much advantage as superior firepower. By the end of 1943, throttle modulation had become a formal topic in Pacific theater fighter training, though it remained unofficial in doctrine manuals until after the war. In practice, the maneuver required judgment, timing, and nerves. Pilots had to maintain situational awareness while deliberately reducing energy in the presence of an enemy capable of turning inside their aircraft. Mistakes could be fatal, yet the successes reinforced confidence. Throttle modulation allowed a smaller force of P-38 seconds to engage larger numbers of Zeros with improved survivability. As the sun dipped behind the volcanic peaks of New Britain, pilots climbed from Henderson Field, P-38 seconds roaring into the twilight. Each throttle adjustment, each carefully timed maneuver, reflected a new philosophy. The mind could be as lethal as the guns. Air combat had become a chess game in 3 dimensions, with human psychology as the hidden variable. By the close of October 1943, the throttle trick had left a lasting mark. Japanese pilots faced a tactical puzzle that exploited both their own training and instinct. Allied pilots gained not only a practical advantage in the skies, but a subtle edge in morale. Each engagement reinforced the lesson learned months before over Rabaul. Sometimes, slowing down was the fastest path to victory. The throttle trick had matured from an instinctive reaction to a defining tactical principle, reshaping Pacific air combat in ways that would resonate through every sortie, every dogfight, and every pilot's calculation of speed, angle, and opportunity. November 1943. The skies over the Treasury Islands, near Bougainville. By late 1943, the throttle trick had evolved beyond individual skill. It had become a central element of squadron-level tactics. Small formations of P-38 seconds, once dependent on raw speed and aggressive boom and zoom maneuvers, now integrated deliberate deceleration into their flight doctrine. This change reflected a deep understanding. When multiple pilots throttled in concert, they could manipulate entire enemy formations, forcing zeros into fatal miscalculations. Lieutenant Richard Bong, now credited with 25 aerial victories, briefed his squadron on November 3 before a patrol over the Treasury Islands. Using a crude map and model aircraft, he demonstrated the concept. "If each of us throttles back at the right moment," he explained, pointing to a formation of Mach zeros drawn on the map, "we can force them into an overshoot, one after the other. It's like cutting a string, they overcommit, and we take the advantage." The mission was straightforward in theory: intercept an expected wave of Japanese fighters escorting bombers. In practice, the coordination required split-second timing, mutual trust, and intense situational awareness. Throttle modulation was no longer merely a reflex. It was now a tool for orchestrating the enemy's defeat. At 0800 hours, 4 P-38 seconds from the 9th Fighter Squadron climbed above the tropical haze. Intelligence indicated 8 Zeros had been spotted near Bougainville, likely escorting Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers targeting Allied supply depots. Captain Charles MacDonald, leading the formation, instructed his pilots: "Throttle down at 1,500 meters. Keep spacing tight. Let them overshoot, then engage. Remember, one burst is all you need if they're lined up." As the P-38 seconds approached, the Zeros swooped into position, confident in their superior maneuverability. In the first seconds, the Americans maintained high speed, preserving altitude and energy. Then, in a coordinated action, each P-38 reduced throttle simultaneously. The effect was immediate. Japanese pilots, trained to exploit excess speed, suddenly found themselves overshooting their targets. The first Zero careened past Bong, who opened fire with 20mm and .50 caliber rounds, leaving it spiraling into the green waters below. The second and third Zeros, attempting to follow their leader, also overshot, creating a domino effect that left the bombers momentarily unprotected. Reports from that engagement demonstrate how coordinated throttle modulation amplified the psychological effect. Lieutenant Thomas Maguire, flying wingman to MacDonald, noted, "They were confused. You could see it in their formation. They kept trying to regroup, only to overshoot again. It was like they were flying in slow motion, reacting to a pattern they didn't understand." The squadron's gunnery results were remarkable. Within 5 minutes, 4 Zeros were destroyed, 1 severely damaged, and the bomber formation scattered. No P-38 seconds were lost. The combination of throttle trick and coordinated squadron maneuvers allowed a smaller Allied force to dominate an enemy group with near parity in numbers. Debriefings after the mission emphasized the importance of timing and mutual awareness. Pilots stressed that the throttle trick required precise coordination. If one pilot slowed too early or too late, the entire sequence could fail, exposing the formation to counterattack. Training. Exercises over Henderson Field now included simulated squadron throttling drills, where pilots learned to anticipate each other's movements and maintain cohesion even under the stress of combat. The tactic also influenced Japanese strategy. Intercept reports from the 4th Air Group noted increasing frustration with American formations. Lieutenant Kazuo Sato recorded on the 10th of November 1943, "The P-38 seconds act in unison. Their movements are deliberate. We attempt to lead them into our turn traps, but they slow at the wrong moments. Many of our pilots overshoot and are destroyed. The Americans fly as a single organism." Allied intelligence officers recognized the broader strategic implications. By controlling the engagement through coordinated throttling, small squadrons could effectively neutralize larger Japanese forces, conserve fuel and ammunition, and minimize casualties. Tactical planning began to incorporate predictive modeling of enemy responses, with throttle modulation at its center. Colonel William Kepner wrote in a November report, "We are entering an era where squadron psychology and maneuver synchronization are as critical as individual skill. The throttle trick is not merely a maneuver, it is now a tool for shaping entire battles." The practical benefits were immediate. Patrols that previously resulted in protracted dogfights now concluded in minutes, with decisive results. Pilots reported less fatigue, higher confidence, and reduced exposure to flak and anti-aircraft fire. The P-38 seconds, once vulnerable in low-speed engagements, became almost untouchable when employing coordinated throttling. On November 15th, another mission over the Treasury Islands highlighted the evolution of the tactic. 8 P-38 seconds engaged 12 Zeros. By throttling in sequence, alternating between pairs, pilots created multiple overshoot points, essentially turning the enemy formation into a series of moving targets. By the end of the engagement, 7 Zeros had been all destroyed, 2 damaged, and no Allied aircraft lost. Maguire later noted, "It was almost like conducting a symphony. Every pilot knew his part. Every throttle movement counted. The enemy was caught in our rhythm." The squadron's success had a morale effect beyond the air. Ground crews, support staff, and intelligence officers celebrated these victories as proof that innovation could overcome even the deadliest opposition. Field diaries included comments like, "The boys up there are turning the tables, they slow down, and the Japs can't follow. It's not just flying, it's outthinking them." By the end of November, the throttle trick was no longer an isolated phenomenon. It had become a doctrine in the Pacific theater, integrated into squadron-level operations and influencing tactical decisions across multiple commands. Its success demonstrated the value of psychological and coordinated warfare in the air, foreshadowing broader Allied approaches that would dominate the final years of the conflict. In these months, Allied pilots realized a fundamental truth. Speed alone did not guarantee victory. Precision, timing, and mutual coordination could turn even the most dangerous opponent into a predictable target. The throttle trick, once an instinctive maneuver, had matured into a strategic instrument, one capable of shaping entire engagements and breaking the resolve of enemy pilots. As twilight settled over the Treasury Islands, the P-38 seconds returned to base. Engines hummed a steady rhythm, wings glinting against the sinking sun. Pilots exchanged brief nods and quiet acknowledgements. In the sky, the dance of throttle, maneuver, and mind had reached a new level of sophistication. And in the jungles below, the Japanese pilots who had once dominated the Pacific skies began to learn the hard way that American ingenuity could turn their greatest instincts into their deadliest vulnerability. The throttle trick, born from instinct and refined through trial and error, became more than a maneuver. It became a symbol of Allied adaptability and ingenuity in the Pacific. Individual skill, once the sole determinant of survival, gave way to coordinated precision, turning small squadrons into instruments capable of reshaping entire battles. What began as a single pilot's intuitive decision now echoed across every mission. A testament to the power of observation, creativity, and courage in the face of a deadly adversary. By the end of 1943, Japanese pilots had learned that their famed maneuverability could be turned against them. Accounts from post-war interrogations repeatedly mention the P-38's deceptive slowing tactic as a source of confusion and demoralization. Allied aircrews, meanwhile, gained a psychological edge, knowing that mastery of timing and teamwork could outmatch even the most agile enemy. In the broader context of the Pacific War, this innovation exemplified a critical truth. Technological superiority alone does not guarantee victory. Understanding human reaction, exploiting instinct, and orchestrating collective effort can turn even modest forces into decisive ones. The throttle trick, deceptively simple yet profoundly effective, reshaped air combat doctrine, preserved countless lives, and etched itself into the annals of aviation history as a quiet but unstoppable force. The skies over Rabaul, the Solomons, and the Treasury Islands would never be the same again.